pastors here at First Presbyterian Church. He's going to tell you a little bit about our mainline speaker. Thank you. Eric.
Well, good morning, and thank you to the worship team. This is an amazing gift to be gathered here and to be opening our hearts and lives to what Christ is able to do, which is absolutely profound. Take what we bring and make it something absolutely incredible. We're grateful to have Soong-Chan here this morning. It's a gift to have his, not only his intelligence, but his heart, to be able to speak to us and tell us about this theme for the whole weekend, reconciling all things. We're grateful Soong-Chan is here. We're grateful the weather held off from Chicago, coming from North Park. It's a gift that we are able to have you with us and tell us about the way that we culturally, spiritually, can be reconciled one to another. Soong-Chan has much experience in this regard. He's worked with many organizations, many institutions, many people throughout the world to bring this message of reconciliation to us. It's a joy to welcome this amazing gift of a heart and mind into our presence this morning. And I would ask that we would give him a warm, warm welcome from Santa Barbara Mission Conference. Soong-Chan, welcome.
Tremendously honored by the invitation and the chance to be here with you this weekend. Also very thankful to escape to Chicago weather, where it is approximately negative 55 degrees last time I checked. And to be here in warmer climes is a gift. I want to talk today about what it means to be reconcilers and the humility that is called for in this moment of reconciliation that God is bringing to our nation and to our world, the changes and the things that are occurring right now. I want to take a look at Acts chapter 15. If you have your Bibles, please turn with me to Acts chapter 15. So we're going to continue in looking at the book of Acts and jump a few chapters ahead to chapter 15. And I want to talk about what happens in chapter 15 and how that teaches us for what's happening in the world right now, several thousand years later. But I'll begin with a story. About 5 years ago, I had my first sabbatical from my school. I teach at North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago. So I worked it out so that I could spend the whole year away doing further study at Duke University. So I took my whole family, we moved down to Durham, North Carolina, spent a year away from my teaching position to do further study. But what happened was I was away from my office for a year. And if those of you who are pastors or those of you who have an office know that if you're away even for a week, how much junk mail accumulates during the time that you're away. So imagine how much junk mail had accumulated after a year away from my office. I had 2 piles of mail about this big. I mean, they were just gobs of paper. A lot of it, ironically, from environmental groups asking me to save the environment. A lot of junk mail, paper that I threw away, asking me to save the environment. So I'm going through this piles and piles of junk mail, looking through all of the information, and I stumble across a particular piece of mail that really intrigued me. The cover of it said, "The poor you will not have with you," and it was referencing a passage in the New Testament. And I looked at that for a minute, and as a seminary professor, I said, that is not quite what the Bible actually says. And so every time something like that happens, somebody uses scripture in an inappropriate way, I always get excited because I can use it in illustrations like these conferences. So I said, I'm going to take a second look at this little bit of material. So I opened it up, and the idea of the poor you will not have with you, the idea was that there is extreme poverty in the world. Yes, we need to deal with extreme poverty in the world. But the underlying assumption about dealing with extreme poverty was that we, the church in America, needs to go and fix Africa's poverty problems. So the idea was we would not have the poor with us if only the American church would use their resources, their ingenuity, their education, their know-how to fix Africa's problems. We would no longer have a problem of poverty in Africa. Now, the more I read into this concept, the more I struggled with this, because a lot of what happened in Africa and the problems of Africa now was the same attitude that this DVD material was taking. When the Europeans said, those poor savages in Africa, they so desperately need our help. They need our civilization. They need our laws. They need our resources to go and help those poor savages in Africa. And after hundreds of years of exploitation of those lands and people in Africa, we have the extreme poverty we have today. In other words, to try to fix somebody else's problems, there was a complete absence of humility. There was a complete absence of awareness that the world has changed very dramatically over the last several hundred years. And the way we fix problems then is not the way we're going to fix problems now. The way we went out and tried to change everybody else to make them look like us, that's no longer going to work in a world that has changed very dramatically. So this morning I want to talk about the changes that have occurred in our world in the last 100 years and talk about how those changes reflect what was happening in Acts chapter 15. So let's give a little bit of the background of Acts chapter 15. Some of you know the story. This is the accounting of the Jerusalem Council where the leaders of the early church were gathered together and they were dealing with a number of different variables. The first variable is that when the church started, it was started as a subset or a sect of Judaism. The early leaders were Jews. Jesus was seen as the Jewish Messiah. And so the culture of that early church was very much rooted in Judaism. And one of the aspects of that early church culture was an animosity towards the Gentiles. And it was believed that the Gentiles were outcast and they were not the good people that deserved the grace of God. So there was this animosity between Jews against the Gentiles, and that was also a part of what was going on in the early church. The Gentiles were seen as those outside of the faith. Yet at the same time, we know the rest of the story in Acts, that Paul, through his missionary journeys, through a number of outreaches, Peter and Cornelius, we know that there were Gentile converts to Christianity. We know that Gentiles, in fact, were growing in numbers. And at this particular moment in the church's history, in Acts chapter 15, we're about to encounter the moment where the number of Gentile Christians is about to exceed the number of Jewish Christians. The demographics were about to change over very dramatically. The Jewish Christians were smaller in number than the Gentile Christians who were converting in a much more numerically fast paced. So we're dealing at this moment in Acts chapter 15 in the Jerusalem Council. What do we do with this situation? Where the demographics the church we're comfortable with, that is dominated by Jewish culture, that is a subset or a sect of Judaism, now we can't assume that anymore because the Gentile Christians have come in large numbers and the demographics are about to change very dramatically. So that's the dilemma faced in Acts chapter 15 by the early church. And I would argue that is almost the exact same scenario, just with slightly different characters, 2,000 years later in the 20th and 21st century. That same scenario of one dominant group, the Jewish Christians, in some sense being surpassed by a new group, the Gentile Christians. That story played itself out in the 20th century and now into the 21st century. And we see this by looking at this idea of the changing face of Christianity throughout the world. This is the work of Dana Robert of Boston University, who asked the question in 1950, if you gathered all the Christians in the world together and you picked out one person that represented Christianity in the world and said this person is the quintessential Christian, you would look at these faces, you can go to the next slide, and say these are the faces of a Christianity in the world. In all probability, white male, okay, maybe not that guy, just threw him in there for see if you're paying attention. All probability, white, male, approximately 50 years old, probably living in a suburb about 30 minutes or an hour outside of a major U.S. city. That would be a typical Christian in the year 1950. You could identify these individuals and say that person represents Christianity, the face of Christianity in the year 1950. But if you would ask that same question in the year 2016, or actually by the year 2000, you would come up with a radically different set of faces and different answers. It's not the white male, 50 years old, living in an upper middle class suburb in the United States. Now when you say, who represents Christianity? What is the face of Christianity? Your answer is going to be a Nigerian peasant woman outside of Lagos, Nigeria, a teenager in Mexico City, a university student in Seoul, South Korea. The demographics of Christianity have changed dramatically over the last 50 plus years. Let's look at some numbers to help us understand this a little bit better. Philip Jenkins, who has done some great work on this, he reflects the writings of Andrew Walls of University of Edinburgh, as well as the work of Lamin Sanneh at Yale, as well as the work of Dana Robert at Boston University, Todd Johnson and David Barrett. Todd Johnson is at Gordon Conwell. And see, these are extraordinarily missiologists and scholars who have examined this phenomenon. And Philip Jenkins summarizes that for the last 500 years or so, prior to the 20th century, the story of Christianity was bound up with the story of Europe and North America. And you can speak about a European North American Christianity, a Eurocentric Christianity. However, if you go to the next slide, what we have seen in the last 100 years, over the past century being the 20th century, the center of gravity in the Christian world has shifted away from Europe and North America to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And Christianity is going to have a boom in the new century, meaning the 21st century, but the majority of believers will be neither white, nor European, nor Euro-American. One example of this is offered, I believe it's Barrett and Johnson, who mapped this out and said if you, in the year 1900, took a pin and put it to a world map of where the population center of Christianity was, you would put it right in the middle of the North Atlantic because so many Christians were in Europe and North America. But if you were to do that now, you would put that center of Christianity, that population center, in Timbuktu, Africa. And every hour or so, you would have to take one step southward and one step eastward, because that's how quickly Christianity is moving away from Europe and North America and further into Latin America, Africa, and to Asia. These numbers might help us take a look at that. In the year 1900, you see that European Christianity dominated the Christian population. North America is relatively strong. You see that there's a very small percentage in Africa and Asia. So that if you add up Europe and North America and Australia/New Zealand, only about 16% of the Christians in the world would be of non-European descent in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. By 2005, the numbers there are these massive hundreds of thousands of members in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. In fact, my denomination, the Evangelical Covenant Church, is one of the fastest growing denominations in the United States. It's one of those churches that has not experienced decline. It's actually experienced a significant amount of growth. If we're really generous with the numbers about the Evangelical Covenant Church membership, and I'm being really, really generous, we probably have about 500,000 people at our churches, and I'm being really, really generous. So this denomination, that's one of the fastest growing denominations in the U.S., all of the membership combined is about half the size of one church in Korea. So let's put all of this into perspective of what's going on in the world out there. The church is moving and booming. It's booming in Africa. It's growing in Asia. It's booming in Latin America. And what we're seeing in the U.S. is actually maybe the opposite narrative. But here's maybe the good news in all of this for us here in the United States. Let's go to the next slide. Something happened in the 1960s. A lot of things happened in the 1960s. But Philip Jenkins says that of all the stuff that happened in the 1960s, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Countercultural Revolution, all of these things, he says that the most significant event might be the Immigration Reform Act of 1965. Prior to 1965, there were very specific laws that kept certain people out of this country and they couldn't come in as immigrants. The very first of these laws was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. For an A extra credit, what do you think it did? Yes, it excluded Chinese people from coming into the United States. So they had these guidelines or quotas on who could come into the U.S. and who could not. So prior to 1965, the overwhelming majority of immigrants were of European descent, keeping out African, Asian, and Latin American immigrants kind of through that process. In 1965, the laws change and the quota system is adjusted. By the way, there still is a limit on the number of immigrants. That number gradually increases, but this was not free-for-all immigration. It just changed the patterns of immigration. So the immigrants were not just coming from Europe and North America, they were now coming from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And Jenkins points to that moment in 1965 that inevitably and powerfully changed the course of American church history. Here's how it changed the course of American church history. First of all, the demographics of America has changed very dramatically. You can go to the next slide here. So in 1965, the immigration law changes. Post-1965, you get the influx of non-European immigrants, African, Asian, particularly Asia and Latin America. By 2008, so 8 years ago already, the U.S. minority population was already at 1/3 of American society. So a third, a little bit higher than that, but by 2008, a third of the U.S. population was of non-European descent. Here's a very important number. 2011, 5 years ago, the birth rate in America shifted over, so that the majority of births in America were now of non-European descent. This number is critical because no matter how big of a wall Donald Trump builds on the border of Mexico, and he could, make it lined with gold and put Trump's name all over that wall, no matter how big that wall is, it is not going to change the demographic trends in America. Because it's tied to birth rates, not to immigration patterns. Say that with me. No, don't say it with me. This is tied to birth rates, not to immigration patterns. So if people want to say, let's get America back to a white nation, that's not happening unless you're going to start killing off children. Nobody said that yet. So we're not killing off children, so that means these children are going to grow up, and the majority of children born in the United States are now already of non-European descent. By 2023, that is not that far away from here, is it? 2023, the majority of all children, everybody under the age of 18, are going to be of non-European descent. This is the number that I cite when I speak to Christian colleges. Because many of the Christian colleges that I've worked with and try to help and try to think through strategies, their current incoming class is 90% white. And by 2023, if that current incoming class is still 90% white, you're not going to last as an institution. In fact, you've seen many Christian colleges just shut their doors. Bible colleges, Christian colleges, they can't do it anymore. I went to one school that had about 10 years ago, 2,000 undergraduates. Very robust, dynamic school. They were 98% white somewhere in the South. And they maintained that percentage for the next 10 years. They're down now to about 700 students. And next year will be down to 600 students. The year after that will be down to 500 students. They're not going to survive unless you deal with this demographic reality. Half of the children in the United States are going to be of non-European descent in just a few years. And that's a reality that Christian colleges, churches, and denominations have to deal with. What's the number one concern that most evangelical churches are worried about right now? Millennials. How do we reach the young people? How do we reach the millennials that are leaving the church in large numbers? Well, I've got a very easy answer. The millennials are going to be majority minority, so learn how to reach cross-culturally. That's how you reach the millennials. That's why you can't reach the millennials, because there's a dramatic demographic change that is occurring. So by 2042, the projection is that the U.S. minority population, the entire population of the U.S., will have no clear majority. Within our life, most of our lifetimes, within this generation, we will have a nation with no clear ethnic majority. We will have a nation that is all minorities because the European population will be below 50%. Now, when people look at these numbers, the first concern is, oh no, America is no longer a Christian nation. Oh no, we're going to become a pagan nation because all these non-Christians are coming into the United States. That actually was the hypothesis of Diana Eck, who is a Hindu scholar at Harvard University. And she wrote a book. She got $1 million grant. I don't know what she did with $1 million, but it wasn't research. But she got $1 million grant to study religious patterns in the United States. And she said, the more immigrants and non-Europeans we get to the U.S., the more pluralistic and non-Christian we're going to be. And that was her hypothesis. But what it turned out, and we can go to the next slide here, is that what Stephen Warner discovered at the University of Illinois, Chicago, a sociologist, he's saying that the new immigrants represent not the de-Christianization of American society, but the de-Europeanization of American Christianity. Do you see the difference? People said, oh no, Asians, Latinos, Africans are coming in. They're going to bring all sorts of different religions with them, and we're going to stop being a nation that's filled with Christians. And it turns out, actually, we still got a whole lot of Christians, but they're Korean Christians. They're Ghanaian Christians. They're Mexican Christians. They're Pentecostals that come from Mexico City. They're full gospel folks from Seoul, South Korea. They're coming from all corners of the globe, but they're bringing Christian faith with them. In fact, one of the most amazing retreats I ever led was with an Arabic evangelical church in the city of Boston. I had no idea this church existed. Nobody talked about it. It wasn't on the 6 o'clock news because the 6 o'clock news had other things they wanted to portray about Arabs. But this Arabic evangelical church had 300 first-generation Arabic-speaking Americans who were committed evangelicals, committed Christians. And they were from all over the Middle East. They were Palestinian, they were Jordanian, they were Lebanese, Egyptian, all over the Middle East. They were gathering together in this very vibrant evangelical church of about 300 Arabic-speaking Americans. And their children were all English-speaking. They were bilingual, bicultural, but they were more comfortable with English. So they asked me to come and speak to the second-generation group, which was about 70 people, who were second-generation, all under the age of 25, a very vibrant English-speaking millennial group. By the way, if you're ever invited to speak at the Arabic Evangelical Church, when they say they're starting at 7, they're probably not going to start at 7. I actually showed up at 6:45. I get there a little early. I'm there by myself. 8 o'clock, I'm still there by myself. At about 8:30, one person comes in. By about 9 o'clock, 2 or 3 people have come in. At about 11 o'clock, we get started and we worship. Is that really what? Sure, I was at church on Sunday. They lie about church attendance. So people said, okay, we can't rely on self-reported data about church attendance. We got to figure out another way to figure out church attendance. So Dave Olson said, let's go through church attendance numbers. Because in denominations, you report your attendance at church on Sunday, you send it in. That's a more accurate way, and makes sense, to actually attend the church attendance numbers. Now, I was a pastor for 17 years. I know that those numbers are a little bit inflated too, right? Come on, seriously? When we report to our denominations, you have 297 people at church on Sunday. Do you really write down 297? No, you write down 300 because Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were also in attendance. So even those numbers might be even slightly inflated because you're going to tend to round up. But even with those numbers, what we found is that it's not 40 to 60% at church on Sunday. It is actually down to about 17.5%. Now that makes a little more sense. If you're out there in the morning driving to church, you know that it's not half the population. And you know those who are out on the streets might be going more likely to go to the mall to a football game than they're actually going to a church. So the number of church attendance has declined very dramatically over the last few years. And you can see this breakdown in the next slide here of the ways that it has declined in particular groups. So overall attendance from 1990 to 2005 went from 20.4% down to 17.5%. You can see the very steep drop in Catholic church attendance. And this is problematic for many because many of the Latino immigrants are Catholic, but they're not going or they're leaving the Catholic Church. This particular drop, 7.2 to 6.2, has actually a very specific reference. It was the pedophile scandals that occurred in the Catholic Church during that time period. Many people left the Catholic Church during that time period. But you can also see that the mainline churches experienced a very sharp drop. So if I were to round the numbers, it would be from 4% of the U.S. population down to 3%. And you're saying, hey, that's only a 1% drop. Actually, you have to think about this proportionally. In 15 years, the mainline church lost 1/4 of their membership. 25% of the church disappeared in a very short period of time. That's staggering. That's not just losing members here and there. You're hemorrhaging membership. You're on life support if you're losing 1/4 of your membership in that short period of a time. Now, you can look at the evangelical numbers and say, hey, we're doing okay. I'm an evangelical, I'm down with this, we're not declining a whole lot. But here's the tricky part of this equation. I was at an immigration conference, and some evangelical leaders were there at this conference, and there were some key leaders talking about the need for to support immigration reform, because these evangelicals were saying, our churches are not going to survive without